So Russia's budget requires oil prices at about $112 a barrel in order to be solvent. This is one of the motivators behind what Putin is doing today, because he no longer has that oil income to give prosperity to people, and Russia is hurting economically as a result. So Putin comes to power, and the rest is history, as they say. But let's now, having provided that context from Tsarist times to revolution to Cold War to post-Cold War, let's go to today. And let's say why, my second subject, why are they doing what they're doing? I'm going to give you two big reasons. The first is insecurity. They lost their country. And in doing so, they lost both their inner and their outer security belts. Their outer security belt was what we called the Warsaw Pact, that alliance of countries on their border that were essentially Soviet satellites and that separated them from anyone they could regard as challenging or an enemy. The Warsaw Pact, gone. Most of those countries are NATO members now. This would be like the southern part of our country suddenly joining a foreign alliance. They lost their inner security belt because Russia was surrounded by an empire that the czars had created over centuries. So all of those countries, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of these countries around Russia that the czars had assembled and Stalin had assembled in his latter years, gone. And Russia sits there feeling exposed, feeling insecure. Most Russians today will tell you they were never more secure than they were during the Cold War, even though they were poverty-stricken and oppressed, but they were secure in that sense. The second reason why they're doing this today. They're trying to make up for their inability to match the United States on conventional measures of power. So, Russia's GDP is about 1.3 trillion a year. America's GDP is 18 trillion. Russia's defense budget is about $65 billion a year. That's roughly equivalent to what we're now proposing to add to our defense budget this year, bringing it well over $600 billion. I mean, it's a huge defense budget. Some would say too huge because it equals about 40% of what the rest of the world spends. So they cannot match us in any fair competition. And economically, I've already given you a hint. I mean, we have this, whatever problems our economy has, it is a thriving economy that is open to entrepreneurship, that is open to creativity, that until we recently welcomed immigrants. That wasn't a political comment. But a friend of mine says it, but they have none of that. A friend of mine puts it this way. We're sitting over here at the adult table. Putin is sitting over here at the children's table. He looks over at our table, and it's much higher and richer. And what he's trying to do with all of the things underway is basically saw off the legs of our table to bring our table down to his level. So he can do that by making our election system seem as rigged and corrupt as his is. He can do that by moving into the vacuum that we left, regrettably, in Syria and exerting influence there that now, I think, outweighs ours. So he's basically lowering our table to his level. So those are some of the reasons why Russia is doing it. Now, it's more complicated than I've made it seem, but added to that is his desire to make Russia great again. Let me put it that way. In other words, He once said the greatest tragedy in modern history is the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, if you go anywhere in Russia, or for that matter, in the countries that used to be Russia, you will see monuments to the Great War. War is very important in Russian history. They look back to having repelled Napoleon in 1814, and they look with pride to having defeated the Nazis in World War II. Hitler got only to the outskirts of Moscow. On one of my visits, I actually used to try and have a relationship with the Russian intelligence service on the theory that we do have common interests, even though we are hostile to each other on many grounds, but there are common interests we have. You always look for areas where you can cooperate, even with, this is the intelligence way, even when you have hostility on other areas. On one of my visits there, they took me to the monument just outside Moscow that shows the point at which they stopped the Nazis in World War II. They lost 20 million people in World War II. And the story of how they pulled themselves together after Hitler invaded, Stalin went into a kind of funk, you might say, in American terms, for about 2 weeks, total panic, but then finally came back from his dacha and reorganized the country and moved all of the industry out of the way. So imagine picking up all of your industry and moving it east in order to get it out of the way, and then they began out producing the Nazis in tanks and airplanes and beat them in battles at places like Stalingrad. So they lost their country, and they cannot compete. And so therefore they're trying to restore Russian influence in the world. And I would say that Putin is playing a weak hand very well.